Ruth Burns was still carrying her breast pump bag when Graham Holloway fired her. The glass boardroom blurred around her as her newborn daughter's milk leaked through the front of her silk blouse. Across the table, HR avoided eye contact. Graham kept talking about corporate restructuring, but Ruth couldn't hear him anymore. Because her husband was sitting beside them, Zane didn't look shocked, didn't argue, didn't defend her. He just stared at the polished table like he'd rehearsed this moment already. Then Ruth turned toward the hallway outside the conference room and saw Natalie Cross leaning against the wall, smiling faintly, while wearing the diamond necklace Zane had given Ruth on their anniversary. That was the moment Ruth realized losing her job wasn't the real betrayal. It was losing the only person she thought would protect her. If you've ever discovered someone stopped loving you long before they stopped pretending the story is going to hurt. But stay with Ruth until the end, because some women don't rise after betrayal. They rebuild so powerfully that the people who broke them can only watch. 3 months before Holloway and Pierce fired her, Ruth Burns stood barefoot in her marble kitchen at 2 a.m, eating cold strawberries over the sink while her swollen, pregnant body ached from another 14-hour workday. Outside the enormous windows of their Connecticut home, snow drifted softly across the lawn. Everything looked peaceful from the outside. Expensive, stable, beautiful. That was the tragedy of Ruth's life. From a distance, it looked perfect. Inside, it was quietly starving her. "Baby, you should be sleeping." Zane's voice had floated into the kitchen, warm and charming like always. He walked toward her in gray sweatpants, his dark hair messy, in the way magazines called effortless. Even after 7 years of marriage, women still stared at him in restaurants. Ruth used to feel proud when they did. Back then, she still believed she was the woman he loved most. "I had another client crisis." Ruth sighed, rubbing her stomach. The Phoenix account almost collapsed. Zane wrapped his arms around her from behind and kissed her temple. "You work too hard." She leaned into him automatically. "Somebody has to pay for this absurd kitchen renovation you wanted." He laughed softly. "And I'll make it up to you one day when my investments take off." That sentence had become the soundtrack of their marriage. One day. One day, Zane would contribute more. One day, he would become successful again. One day, Ruth wouldn't have to carry both their lives on her shoulders. But Ruth never complained, because she loved him. Or maybe because she had spent so many years confusing love with endurance. When Zane's tech startup failed 3 years earlier, Ruth had quietly emptied half her savings to protect him from humiliation. She had canceled her dream partnership opportunity in Chicago because he wasn't emotionally ready to move. She worked through weekends, holidays, migraines, and eventually pregnancy because somebody needed to keep their life afloat. And every time she sacrificed something, Zane kissed her forehead and called her his rock. Ruth thought that meant gratitude. Now she realized it only meant dependency. The first real crack appeared during her 7th month of pregnancy. She still remembered standing in the nursery, holding tiny white baby clothes, while Zane sat on the edge of their bed texting, someone smiling faintly at his phone. "Who's making you grin like that?" she teased. He locked the screen too quickly. "Just work." Something cold brushed against her chest then. Tiny, sharp. But pregnancy had already filled her with enough fears. She ignored it. Then came the hospital, 21 hours of labor, bright lights, exhaustion, nurses rushing in and out. Ruth remembered gripping the rails of the hospital bed while contractions tore through her body like violence. She remembered screaming Zane's name, and she remembered him stepping into the hallway every 15 minutes to answer important calls. After Lily was born, Ruth cried the moment they placed the baby on her chest. Zane barely looked up from his phone. At the time, Ruth forgave him instantly. He's stressed, she told herself. That became her favorite lie. By the time maternity leave began, their marriage felt like a luxury hotel suite after checkout. Beautiful. Empty. No warmth left inside it. Zane stopped touching her casually, stopped asking if she'd eaten, stopped looking at her when she spoke. Meanwhile, Ruth disappeared inside motherhood, the sleepless nights, the leaking milk, the aching body she no longer recognized, the terrifying loneliness of keeping another human alive. Some nights she sat in the nursery at 4 a.m, holding Lily while silently crying, so nobody would hear her. Zane slept through most of it, and still Ruth defended him to everyone. He's overwhelmed. He's adjusting. It's hard for fathers, too. The cruelest women are not always the ones who lie to others. Sometimes they are the women who lie to themselves to survive. now sitting in the passenger seat of her own car outside Holloway, and Pierce after being fired. Ruth stared blankly through the windshield while rain slid down the glass. Her breast pump bag sat beside her like a cruel joke. Her phone buzzed. Zane. She almost ignored it. Almost. But old habits are hard to kill. Hey, she answered weakly. We need to talk before you come home. Before you come home. Not, are you okay? Not, I'm sorry. Not, this was wrong. Ruth closed her eyes. You knew, she whispered. Silence. Then Zane exhaled slowly. Ruth, it wasn't my decision, but you knew it was complicated. No. Her voice cracked. Actually, it feels pretty simple. Another pause. We can survive this, he said carefully. You've been emotional lately, and maybe this gives you time to focus on Lily. Ruth felt something inside her physically recoil. Emotional lately. There it was. The soft-polished version of every insult women hear after childbirth. Too emotional, too tired, too hormonal, too difficult, never too betrayed. Ruth hung up without answering. For several minutes she just sat there gripping the steering wheel, while humiliation crawled over her skin. Women like Ruth were taught to survive pain quietly, smile at dinner parties, send thank you cards, lose weight after childbirth, return to work polished and grateful. No one teaches women what to do when humiliation finally turns into rage. When Ruth finally drove home, the house was spotless. Of course it was. Zane only cleaned when he was preparing an argument. He stood in the kitchen wearing a navy sweater she bought him last Christmas. The smell of expensive cologne lingered in the air. He looked nervous. Good. For the first time in months, Ruth wanted him uncomfortable. Ruth, how long? He blinked. What? How long did you know? Zane rubbed the back of his neck. A couple weeks. Her stomach dropped. A couple weeks, she repeated faintly. I was trying to protect you until things were finalized. Protect you. The audacity almost made her laugh. You sat beside me every night while I pumped milk for our daughter, and let me talk about going back to work. Her voice trembled harder now. You watched me prepare presentations. You helped me pick outfits for today. It wasn't personal. Ruth stared at him in disbelief. That's what men say when they're about to destroy a woman they benefited from. His jaw tightened. You're making this dramatic. Something dangerous flashed behind Ruth's exhaustion then. Dramatic. Not devastated. Not betrayed. Dramatic. Before she could answer, Lily began crying upstairs. Instinctively, Ruth moved toward the stairs first. Of course she did. She always did. As she climbed upward, her phone buzzed again in her coat pocket. This time it wasn't Zane. It was his phone lighting up on the kitchen counter. A message preview appeared before the screen dimmed. Natalie Cross. Did she take it badly? Ruth froze on the staircase. The world did not shatter dramatically. It shattered quietly, like ice cracking beneath someone who trusted the surface too much. Ruth did not confront Zane that night. That was the part she would later remember most clearly. Not the betrayal, not the affair, not even the humiliation of being fired. It was the silence. The terrifying silence of a woman realizing her marriage was dying while she still had to warm bottles, fold baby clothes, and survive the morning. Lily cried softly in Ruth's arms as she sat in the nursery, rocking chair near Dawn. The pale blue walls blurred through exhaustion. Her daughter's tiny fingers curled around the fabric of Ruth's sweater, without understanding that her mother's entire life had cracked open overnight. Down the hall, Zane slept peacefully. That almost destroyed her more than the cheating itself. How could someone sleep so calmly beside betrayal? Ruth looked down at Lily's sleepy face and whispered shakily, I'm going to figure this out, I promise. But she had no idea how. The next few days became unbearable theater. Zane acted careful, softer than usual. Guilty people often mistake politeness for redemption. He brought coffee into her office while she pretended to search job listings. You should take some time before rushing into anything, he said gently. Ruth stared at the laptop screen. We have a mortgage. We'll manage. We. The word sounded rotten now. At breakfast, he kissed Lily's forehead like a loving husband in a commercial. At night, he asked Ruth whether she needed help with diapers, but he never touched her anymore. Not really. No hand lingering on her waist, no unconscious affection, no warmth. It was kindness performed from obligation, and once Ruth noticed it, she couldn't stop noticing everything else. The secret smiles at his phone, the sudden gym obsession, the expensive cologne he only wore to late meetings, the way he angled his screen away from her instinctively. Her body understood the truth before her mind fully accepted it. One afternoon, while Lily slept against her chest, Ruth opened Instagram and typed Natalie Cross into the search bar. Natalie's profile looked exactly like Ruth remembered: polished blonde hair, sharp cheekbones, expensive taste disguised as effortless elegance. The kind of woman corporate men called refreshing, while punishing women like Ruth for becoming mothers. At first, Ruth saw nothing suspicious. Then she noticed the backgrounds: a rooftop bar in Manhattan, a steakhouse in Boston, a luxury hotel in Chicago, places Zane had visited during business travel. Her stomach tightened. Ruth opened another photo. Natalie sat beside a champagne glass smiling into the camera while city lights glittered behind her and reflected faintly in the restaurant window behind Natalie Zane. Ruth froze. The image was blurry, almost impossible to notice unless someone was searching desperately for evidence. But once she saw him, she couldn't unsee him. Her hands began shaking so hard she nearly dropped the phone onto Lily. "No," she whispered automatically. Denial is a strange thing. Even after evidence appears, love still bargains for survival. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe the reflection distorted things. Maybe she was paranoid. But deep down, Ruth already knew. Women always know. We simply delay our own heartbreak because truth changes everything once spoken aloud. That evening, Zane announced another business dinner. "Client emergency," he said while buttoning his charcoal coat. Ruth looked up from Lily's high chair. With Graham, yeah. He wouldn't meet her eyes. For one dangerous second, Ruth almost confronted him. Instead, she smiled faintly. "Drive safe." The lie tasted like blood in her mouth. An hour later, Ruth stood outside a rooftop restaurant in downtown Manhattan wearing a beige wool coat over black leggings, her hair shoved into a loose bun from exhaustion. She felt ridiculous. 34 years old, postpartum, sleep-deprived, standing in cold wind like a suspicious girlfriend from a movie. Part of her hated herself for coming. Another part already knew she needed to see it with her own eyes. The hostess smiled politely. "Reservation." Ruth swallowed. "I'm meeting someone." Technically true. She was meeting the truth. The rooftop glowed gold beneath hanging lights and flickering candles. Wealthy people laughed softly over wine glasses, while jazz music drifted through the winter air. Then Ruth saw them. Zane sat at a corner table beside Natalie. Too close, much too close. His body leaned toward her naturally intimately, the way it used to lean toward Ruth years ago. And Natalie was laughing, not politely, comfortably, like she belonged beside him. Ruth stopped breathing. The emotional pain came physically first, a crushing pressure in her ribs, a wave of nausea, heat crawling across her skin. She watched Zane reach for Natalie's hand across the table. Casual, practiced, familiar, as if this had happened many times before. Then Natalie turned slightly beneath the candlelight, and Ruth saw the necklace. Diamond droplets arranged in delicate silver. Her anniversary necklace. 5 years earlier, Zane gave it to Ruth after she closed the largest contract of her career. "You deserve beautiful things," he told her that night. Now another woman wore it while sleeping with her husband. Ruth thought heartbreak would feel explosive. Instead, it felt cold, like slowly drowning under ice. She remained hidden near the entrance, unable to move. Then she heard Graham Holloway's voice approaching from another table nearby. He sat down briefly beside Zane and Natalie, holding a whiskey glass. "You two need to keep this quiet until the restructuring settles," Graham muttered. Natalie rolled her eyes playfully. "Relax. Ruth still thinks Zane hangs the moon." The three of them laughed. Ruth's vision blurred instantly. Not because of tears, because humiliation this deep becomes disorienting. Graham lowered his voice. "Once Ruth's completely out, Natalie steps into leadership smoothly. Investors already prefer the image. Ruth almost laughed hysterically. For years she had sacrificed her health, sleep, and motherhood for that company. But now her postpartum body no longer matched the image. Natalie touched Zane's wrist lightly. Honestly, this would have been messier if Ruth fought harder. Zane exhaled slowly. "She's tired. She'll let it go eventually." Something inside Ruth died then. Not love. Love had been dying for months. This was respect. Respect for the man she married. Respect for the life she defended. Respect for the version of herself who kept forgiving things she should have walked away from. She stepped backward before they could see her. One step, then another. By the time she reached the elevator, her breathing had become ragged. Inside the mirrored walls of the elevator, she barely recognized herself. Pale skin, exhausted eyes, hair falling loose around her face. A woman abandoned emotionally long before she understood it. Her reflection looked smaller than she remembered, but beneath the devastation, something unfamiliar flickered quietly. Anger. Real anger. Not sadness, not insecurity, not desperation to be loved again, just anger. The elevator doors opened into the freezing Manhattan night. Ruth wrapped her coat tighter around herself as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. People passed her on the sidewalk without noticing. The city kept moving, and for the first time in years, Ruth understood something terrifying. The woman Zane betrayed wasn't weak. She was simply exhausted from carrying everyone else. Behind her, through the glowing rooftop windows, high above the street, she could still see Zane laughing beside Natalie. Like Ruth had already disappeared. Ruth came home that night carrying takeout containers she never intended to eat. That was the first performance. She needed Zane to believe she was still the same woman. Hurt maybe, confused, but manageable. Not dangerous. The house smelled like cedarwood candles and expensive detergent. Lily's soft lullaby machine hummed upstairs through the baby monitor speaker. For one painful moment, the normalcy almost broke her. How many women stood inside beautiful homes while their lives quietly collapsed around them? Zane looked up from the kitchen island when she entered. "There you are." His tone sounded careful. "I was getting worried." Worried. Ruth almost admired how naturally lies came to him. "I stopped for food," she said evenly. "You should have told me." She placed the takeout bag on the counter. "I didn't realize I needed permission." His jaw tightened slightly. Tiny crack. Good. Before Ruth would have apologized immediately to smooth tension over. That was who she had become in this marriage emotional housekeeping staff, cleaning every uncomfortable feeling before it became conflict. Not tonight. Zane walked toward her slowly. "Look, I know today was awful. Awful. Such a small word for public humiliation and private betrayal." Ruth shrugged off her coat carefully. "I'm tired. You've been exhausted for months." There it was again. That subtle redirection, that manipulation disguised as concern. Not "I betrayed you." Instead, "You're unstable." Ruth met his gaze calmly. "Having a newborn tends to do that. You know that's not what I mean." She did know, and that was the problem. Zane stepped closer, lowering his voice into the soothing tone he used whenever he wanted control back. "Ruth, ever since the pregnancy, things have felt different." Her chest tightened. Different. Such a cowardly word. Different meant less attractive, less useful, less convenient, less desired. Different meant he wanted another woman but still needed Ruth to feel responsible for it. She folded her arms. "Say what you actually mean." A flicker of irritation crossed his face before he smoothed it away. "You've been emotional. Reactive." Ruth stared at him in disbelief. "Reactive?" "You take everything personally lately." Her laugh came out sharp and humorless. "I got fired on my first day back from maternity leave." "I'm talking about your energy for months now. Energy. Another vague little weapon men use when they don't want to admit cruelty directly." Ruth suddenly remembered every moment she cried quietly in the bathroom postpartum because she no longer recognized her body. Every night she begged herself to be prettier, sexier, easier. Meanwhile, he was already sleeping with Natalie. The realization made her physically cold. Upstairs, Lily began crying. Instantly, Ruth moved toward the stairs. Zane didn't. Of course he didn't. Ruth paused halfway up the staircase and looked back at him. "You know what's funny?" she said softly. "What?" "You keep calling me emotional, but somehow I'm still the only adult in this house." For the first time all evening, Zane looked genuinely angry. Good. Let him feel something uncomfortable for once. Ruth spent the next hour feeding Lily in the nursery while rain tapped softly against the windows. The rocking chair creaked beneath her exhausted body. Her daughter's tiny breathing gradually slowed against her chest. Motherhood had cracked Ruth open emotionally in ways she never expected. Nobody warned women how lonely it could feel. People brought flowers to hospitals and disappeared afterward. They celebrated the baby, but ignored the woman bleeding quietly behind the celebration. and Ruth had been bleeding emotionally for months. She looked down at Lily's sleeping face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not because of the divorce she suddenly sensed approaching, but because Lily deserved a mother who wasn't constantly shrinking herself to survive love. When Ruth finally carried Lily back into the crib, she noticed the baby monitor blinking strangely beside the changing table. A recording notification, probably accidental. Half asleep, Ruth tapped the playback button absent-mindedly while folding tiny pajamas. At first she only heard static, then Zane's voice. "She's become impossible to deal with lately." Ruth froze. The timestamp showed 2 nights earlier. Her fingers tightened around the onesie in her hands. Another male voice answered, "Graham Holloway." She was always too emotionally attached to the company. Zane laughed quietly. Now she's emotionally attached to literally everything. The room tilted slightly. Ruth sat down slowly in the rocking chair as the recording continued. "She used to be sharp," Graham said. "Pregnancy changed her. Motherhood changed her," Zane corrected casually. "Honestly, she's just tired all the time now. Tired." As if exhaustion erased value. Ruth pressed her hand against her mouth. The cruelty wasn't loud. That's what made it worse. No screaming, no dramatic insults, just 2 men calmly discussing the decline of a woman who sacrificed herself for both of them. "She's become dead weight," Zane said finally. Dead weight. Ruth stopped breathing. Not wife, not partner, not mother of his child. Dead weight. Milk leaked painfully through Ruth's nursing bra again, as tears blurred her vision. Her postpartum body suddenly felt humiliating, heavy, broken. She had carried Lily for 9 months while working through swollen ankles and vomiting and migraines. She nearly hemorrhaged during labor, and somehow the final conclusion was still dead weight. Ruth turned the recording off abruptly. Silence crashed into the nursery. Then she cried, not gracefully, not quietly, the kind of crying that folds a woman in half because the pain is finally too heavy to carry elegantly. She cried into one of Lily's tiny blankets so nobody downstairs would hear her breaking apart. At some point, there was a soft knock at the nursery door. Ruth wiped her face quickly. Ruth Burns stepped inside carefully. Zane's mother rarely visited unexpectedly. Elegant and emotionally reserved Eleanor always seemed like a woman who had mastered surviving disappointment quietly. Her silver blonde hair was pinned neatly despite the late hour. "I saw the nursery light on," Eleanor said softly. Ruth forced composure. Lily woke up. Eleanor studied her for a long moment. Women like Eleanor notice things because they've lived through things. "You've been crying." Ruth almost denied it automatically. Then exhaustion won. "Yes." Eleanor sat carefully in the chair across from her. Was today really about restructuring? The question hung heavily between them. Ruth looked away toward Lily's crib. "I don't know anymore." That was the closest she could get to truth without collapsing completely. Eleanor's expression changed subtly. Not shock, recognition, as if some old memory passed briefly across her face. "He's becoming his father," she murmured quietly. Ruth blinked. "What?" But Eleanor stood already smoothing invisible wrinkles from her blazer. "Get some sleep, sweetheart. Sweetheart." Zane's mother had never called her that before. After Eleanor left, Ruth sat motionless for several minutes. Then slowly, almost mechanically, she reached for her old laptop, stored beneath the nursery bookshelf. Dust coated the corners. She opened it carefully. Folders from another version of herself filled the screen, pitch concepts, branding strategies, startup proposals, expansion plans. Back when Ruth still dreamed beyond survival, one file caught her attention immediately. Burns' creative founding proposal. Her heartbeat slowed strangely. 5 years ago, before Zane convinced her stability mattered more than risk, Ruth had planned to launch her own ethical branding agency. She clicked the file open. Slide after slide appeared women-led campaigns, authentic storytelling, anti-exploitation branding models, vision, ambition. Hers, not Graham's, not Zane's. For the first time since being fired, Ruth felt something besides grief. Not hope yet, but possibility. She stared at the glowing laptop screen while dawn slowly approached outside the nursery windows. Maybe losing everything wasn't the end of her life. Maybe it was the first honest thing that had happened to her in years. Ruth barely slept after finding the old business proposal. At 6 a.m, she sat cross-legged on the nursery floor, wearing one of Zane's oversized sweatshirts, while Lily slept against her chest. The laptop screen glowed beside her, illuminating words written by a younger version of herself, a version that still believes she deserves space in the world. Burns Creative Group. The name looked almost unreal now. 5 years ago, Ruth imagined building a branding agency focused on honesty instead of manipulation, campaigns led by women, ethical storytelling, companies that treated people like humans instead of disposable optics. Then life happened. Marriage, bills, compromise, motherhood. Somewhere between loving everyone else, Ruth stopped protecting herself. She reopened the financial projections carefully. The numbers were old, but the ideas still felt alive. For the first time in weeks, her pulse quickened for a reason that wasn't panic. Downstairs, she heard Zane leaving for work. "Bye," he called casually. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "We need counseling." Not, "I'm sorry I betrayed you." Just bye. Like their marriage was still normal enough for routine. Ruth closed her eyes. The terrifying thing about emotional betrayal wasn't the affair itself. It was realizing the other person already adapted to a life without you, while you were still fighting for the relationship. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed beside her knee. Daniel Mercer. Ruth stared at his name for several seconds before answering. Daniel had been one of her closest friends in college before life pulled them into separate worlds. Now he was a high-profile employment attorney in Manhattan, known for destroying corporations politely. "Hey, stranger," Daniel said warmly. "Your message sounded serious." Ruth looked toward Lily instinctively. "I got fired." Silence. "Then what first day back from maternity leave?" Daniel swore under his breath immediately. That alone almost made Ruth cry, not because he solved anything, but because somebody finally reacted like it was wrong. She explained everything quietly, the meeting Graham, the timing, the replacement, the comments, the recording. Daniel interrupted only once. "You have a recording of them discussing your pregnancy and motherhood negatively." "Yes." Another silence. This one sharper. "Ruth," he said carefully, "do you understand how bad that is legally?" Her laugh sounded hollow. "I'm a little overwhelmed to think strategically right now." "Then let me think strategically for you." Something inside Ruth loosened painfully at those words. Support, real support, not manipulation disguised as concern. Daniel continued, voice-focused now. "Do not delete anything. Emails, texts, recordings, performance reviews, keep all of it." "Okay, and don't let them convince you this was performance-related." Ruth looked down at Lily's tiny sleeping face. "They already are. That's because corporations rely on exhausted women doubting themselves." The sentence hit hard because it was true. Postpartum women were expected to bleed gracefully, to smile gratefully, to carry unbearable emotional weight while apologizing for needing help. Ruth had spent months questioning herself instead of questioning the people failing her. Daniel softened slightly. "How are you holding up personally?" The honesty almost slipped out before she stopped it. "Terribly. My husband is cheating on me. I think my entire life was built around people using my loyalty." Instead, she whispered, "I don't know." "That's honest, at least." After the call ended, Ruth sat motionless for several minutes. Then she opened her contacts. Her thumb hovered over old client names. Fear rose instantly. What if nobody cared anymore? What if Graham was right? What if motherhood had made her irrelevant? That last fear hurt most because part of her believed it. Ruth inhaled shakily and pressed call. Ava Bennett speaking. Ruth nearly hung up. Ava Bennett was the founder of Bennett Living, one of the fastest-growing luxury wellness brands in the country. Ruth helped secure her first national campaign years ago. "Ava." "It's Ruth Burns." A pause. Then immediate warmth. "Ruth." "Oh my God. I heard rumors something happened at Holloway and Pierce." "Rumors already. Corporate America moved like blood in water." Ruth swallowed. "Yeah, I'm no longer with them." Another pause. Then Ava's voice lowered carefully. "Their loss." The words hit Ruth harder than expected because lately, every interaction made her feel disposable, not valuable. Disposable, I actually wanted to ask. Ruth hesitated. "If you'd ever consider working with an independent consultant," Independent Ava sounded intrigued immediately. "Are you finally starting your own firm? Finally. Not, why would you do that? Not, Can you handle it with a baby?" Finally. Ruth looked toward the nursery window where pale morning sunlight spilled softly across the carpet. "Maybe." Ava laughed softly. "Ruth, half the reason I stayed with Holloway and Pierce was because of you." Ruth blinked. "What? You were the only person there who understood emotional branding instead of fake marketing psychology." For several seconds, Ruth couldn't speak. She had spent months shrinking inside herself while strangers still remembered her value clearly. Ava continued. "Honestly, when your maternity leave started, the whole energy shifted. Energy. Funny how differently that word sounded when spoken with respect instead of criticism. Listen, Ava said I've actually been considering pulling our account from Holloway." Ruth sat upright instantly. Bennett Living was enormous. Why they've become arrogant, disconnected, everything feels manufactured now, because Ruth wasn't there anymore. The realization landed slowly. Maybe she had been the heart of more things than she realized. Ava lowered her voice. "If you launch something, I'd absolutely take a meeting." After the call ended, Ruth stared at the wall in stunned silence. Then Lily started crying softly from the crib. Reality rushed back immediately. Dirty bottles, laundry piles, sleep deprivation, legal fears. Her life was still a disaster. But now there was a small opening inside the darkness, a possibility. Downstairs, Ruth carried Lily into the kitchen while balancing the baby against one shoulder. Formula bottles crowded the sink beside untouched wine glasses from one of Zane's networking dinners. The contrast suddenly disgusted her. Ruth opened the fridge and realized she hadn't eaten properly in almost 2 days. Postpartum survival had trained her to place herself last automatically. As she bounced Lily gently, her laptop chimed from the counter. New email. Tyler Reed. Ruth frowned in surprise. Tyler had been one of the youngest strategists on her team at Holloway and Pierce. Brilliant, but overlooked. She opened the message quickly. Heard what happened? Nobody believes the restructuring excuse. People are furious. Her throat tightened. Another line appeared beneath it. Honestly, most clients trusted you, not Graham. Ruth sat down slowly at the kitchen island. All this time she thought she was the replaceable one. Maybe she wasn't. Maybe the company simply underestimated how much invisible labor she carried, emotionally, creatively, strategically. Women often build entire systems that only collapse after they leave. Another message arrived immediately after. If you build something new, I want in. Ruth stared at the words until her vision blurred. Nobody had chosen her first in a very long time. Not at work, not at home. Lily fussed softly against her shoulder. Ruth kissed the top of her daughter's head while tears burned behind her eyes. Then she opened the old business proposal again. This time she didn't read it like a fantasy. She read it like a blueprint. Hours later, while Lily slept beside her in a portable bassinet near the dining table, Ruth sat surrounded by notebooks, legal pads, and coffee cups. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to save her marriage. She was trying to save herself. And somewhere deep beneath the grief, humiliation, and exhaustion, that felt strangely powerful. The first time Ruth signed the paperwork for Burns' creative group, Lily was asleep against her chest in a fabric baby carrier, while cold coffee sat untouched beside her laptop. It was 3:42 in the morning. Rain tapped softly against the dining room windows, and the enormous Connecticut house felt hollow around her now. Not luxurious, not comforting, just expensive silence. Ruth adjusted the baby carrier gently while reviewing incorporation documents through burning eyes. People loved romanticizing reinvention. They pictured triumphant music, confidence, empowerment. The truth looked more like cracked lips, postpartum, bleeding, unpaid anxiety, and a woman trying not to wake her infant while rebuilding her entire identity at a dining table. Her phone buzzed. "Daniel, please tell me you've slept," he said immediately. Ruth laughed tiredly. "Define sleep, you sound awful. I look worse." But underneath the exhaustion, something had changed. Purpose. Pain still lived inside her chest like broken glass, but now it existed beside momentum. Daniel sighed. "I reviewed everything you sent me. And honestly," papers shuffled on his end, "Graham Holloway may have handed us a legal nightmare gift basket." Despite herself, Ruth smiled faintly. It felt strange hearing someone speak about her suffering like it mattered legally instead of emotionally. You have suspicious termination timing, discriminatory comments. Internal restructuring inconsistencies in recorded conversations. Ruth rubbed her forehead. I don't even know if I want a lawsuit. That's because you're still grieving. Daniel replied calmly. Women are trained to minimize betrayal until they emotionally collapse from it. His words landed heavily, because Ruth had minimized everything. Zane's distance, the manipulation, the loneliness, the affair. She kept shrinking reality to protect other people from discomfort. Daniel continued carefully. You don't need to decide anything yet, but Ruth, they counted on you being too exhausted to fight back. Her eyes drifted toward Lily, sleeping peacefully against her. They might be right. No, Daniel said firmly. You're exhausted. That's different from weak. The sentence stayed with her long after the call ended. Exhausted was temporary. Weak implied identity. Around noon, Ruth drove to the tiny office space Tyler Reed found online for cheap rent 30 minutes outside Manhattan. The building was old brick with uneven floors and terrible fluorescent lighting. Nothing like the sleek luxury offices at Holloway and Pierce, and somehow Ruth loved it instantly. This place is awful, Tyler admitted while unlocking the door. Ruth stepped inside slowly. Dust floated through sunlight near the windows. Empty rooms echoed quietly around them. But for the first time in months, nobody here had betrayed her yet. That's okay, she whispered. Tyler glanced at her carefully. He looked nervous, younger than she remembered outside the corporate environment. You know people at Holloway are panicking, right? Ruth blinked. Why? Because clients keep asking about you. A dangerous emotion flickered inside her. Validation. Tyler leaned against the doorway. You have no idea how many campaigns were basically held together by you. Ruth almost argued automatically. Women conditioned for emotional labor rarely recognize their own influence. But then she remembered staying awake until 2 a.m. fixing presentations, calming furious clients, rebuilding collapsing campaigns, mentoring employees, protecting Graham's reputation constantly. She carried that company emotionally for years, and they called her dead weight. Tyler handed her a folder. What's this? Potential startup costs. Also, he hesitated awkwardly. I quit this morning. Ruth stared at him. What? I'm done there. Tyler, I mean it. His voice strengthened now. I watched them erase you the second you became inconvenient. Emotion rose unexpectedly in Ruth's throat. You don't owe me loyalty. Tyler gave a sad smile. That's the thing. You were the only leader there who ever treated people like humans instead of productivity machines. For several seconds, Ruth couldn't speak. She spent so long feeling invisible at home that basic respect now felt overwhelming. Her eyes burned. She looked away quickly before crying. Again. God, she was tired of crying. That evening, Ruth returned home carrying office supply catalogs and legal paperwork while Lily slept in her car seat. The house was dark except for kitchen lights. Zane stood at the island pouring whiskey. The sight alone irritated her now. Men always seemed to find time for their own emotional coping mechanisms. Where were you? He asked casually. Ruth removed Lily carefully from the carrier. Out. With who, funny? He suddenly cared about honesty now. With people who still respect me. Zane's expression tightened immediately. Small victory. As Ruth prepared Lily's bottle at the counter, she felt his eyes following her movements, assessing, calculating. Like he sensed something changing but didn't understand what yet. You've been distant, he said finally. The audacity nearly made her laugh. Distant! After the affair, after the firing, after the manipulation. Ruth turned slowly. That's interesting coming from you. His jaw flexed. There's no reason to become hostile. No. Her voice stayed calm, which somehow felt more dangerous than yelling. What would qualify as a reason exactly? Zane took a slow sip of whiskey. I know you're angry. You don't know anything about me lately. That hit him. Good. Silence stretched between them while Lily fussed softly in Ruth's arms. Finally, Zane spoke again. What's going on with you? There it was. Not concern. Control. He sensed emotional distance slipping beyond his reach. Ruth adjusted Lily against her shoulder carefully. I'm figuring things out. What does that mean? It means, she said quietly, I spent years building everyone else's future while mine disappeared. His eyes narrowed slightly. You're talking differently, because she was finally thinking differently. That terrified him more than tears ever could. Later that night, Ruth sat in the nursery floor surrounded by contracts while Lily slept nearby. Her body ached from exhaustion, breastfeeding every few hours, barely eating, running on adrenaline and heartbreak. Still, she kept working. At 11:30, there was another knock at the door. Eleanor Burns entered carrying 2 garment bags and a paper bakery box. Ruth blinked in surprise. "Eleanor, I brought food," Eleanor said simply. "You look half dead." Oddly enough, it comforted Ruth, more than false reassurance would have. Eleanor placed pastries on the dresser before looking around at the scattered paperwork. "What's all this?" Ruth hesitated. Then quietly, "I'm starting a company." To her surprise, Eleanor didn't look shocked. She looked relieved. "What kind brand strategy? Ethical marketing?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "You always should have done that." Ruth stared at her. "I had responsibilities." Eleanor gave a bitter little smile. "Yes, I remember what that excuse sounds like." Something old and wounded passed briefly through Eleanor's expression. Suddenly, Ruth understood. Zane learned emotional selfishness somewhere. Eleanor reached into her purse calmly and placed an envelope onto the nursery floor beside Ruth. "What's this? Open it!" Inside was a cashier's check. Ruth's stomach dropped. "Eleanor, it's not charity. I can't take this." "Yes, you can. The amount was enough to cover several months of office rent and startup costs." Ruth looked up, stunned. "Why are you helping me?" Eleanor's eyes moved toward sleeping Lily. "Because one day, my granddaughter is going to learn what love looks like from you." Her voice softened painfully, "and I would very much like her to learn strength instead of survival." Ruth broke then, not loudly, just silent tears sliding down her face while exhaustion and gratitude tangled painfully together. Eleanor squeezed her hand once. "You know," she said quietly, "women like you are dangerous once they stop begging to be chosen." After Eleanor left, Ruth sat awake long into the night, staring at incorporation papers spread across the nursery floor. Burns Creative Group. The name no longer felt imaginary. It felt inevitable. Downstairs, she heard Zane moving around the kitchen, then silence. A few moments later, his footsteps stopped outside the nursery door. He knocked once before opening it slightly. His eyes immediately landed on the paperwork surrounding her. The office lease, business filings, financial projections. His expression darkened instantly. "You're seriously doing this?" Ruth looked up calmly. For the first time in years, she didn't feel smaller than him. "Yes," she said, and something in Zane's face finally shifted toward fear. Zane stared at the business paperwork spread across the nursery floor like it personally offended him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Lily slept peacefully in her crib beside them, completely unaware that her parents' marriage was finally collapsing under the weight of truth. Ruth remained seated on the floor in gray sweatpants and an oversized sweater, her laptop still open beside scattered financial projections. Exhausted, heartbroken, postpartum, and somehow, for the first time in months, not powerless. Zane stepped farther into the nursery and closed the door quietly behind him. "You're starting a competing agency." His tone carried disbelief more than anger, like he genuinely couldn't imagine Ruth existing outside the role of supportive wife. "Yes." "You're serious." "I just said yes." His jaw tightened. Ruth noticed lately that silence unsettled him more than emotional reactions ever did. He knew how to manage tears, guilt, fragility. Calmness frightened him. Zane crossed his arms. "This is impulsive." Ruth almost laughed. "Interesting. When he cheated, lied, and helped destroy her career, those were strategic decisions. But when she tried to rebuild her life suddenly, she was impulsive." "Is it?" she asked quietly. "You have a newborn Ruth. So maybe this isn't the time to gamble everything." Everything. Another revealing word, because from Zane's perspective, Ruth rebuilding herself threatened everything benefiting him. Their house, their status, his comfort, his control. Ruth slowly stood from the nursery floor, careful not to wake Lily. "I already gambled everything," she said softly. "I gambled it on you." The words landed harder than yelling would have. Zane looked away first. Small victory. He rubbed his forehead impatiently. "You're turning this into something bigger than it is." Ruth stared at him. That sentence, that exact sentence, had followed women for generations. When husbands cheated, "You're overreacting." when bosses discriminated. Don't make it personal when women finally broke under pressure. You're too emotional. She walked past him toward the dresser slowly. What exactly is it, Zane? You know what I mean. No, Ruth said calmly. Actually, I don't anymore. His frustration sharpened visibly now. You lost one job. She froze. One job? As if she wasn't publicly humiliated after maternity leave, as if he wasn't sleeping with another woman, as if her entire identity hadn't been systematically dismantled for months. Ruth turned toward him slowly. That's fascinating coming from someone who nearly collapsed when his startup failed. His face changed instantly. Direct hit. For years, Ruth protected his ego carefully, like handling fragile glass. Not tonight. You remember that she continued softly. You couldn't get out of bed for weeks. That's different. Why? Because I built that company. Ruth laughed then. Not happily, the kind of laugh that appears when pain finally becomes too absurd to hold quietly. And who carried us financially while you rebuilt yourself? Zane's silence answered for him. Ruth stepped closer now, years of buried resentment rising through her exhaustion. Who canceled her partnership opportunity in Chicago because you weren't emotionally ready to leave Connecticut? He shifted uncomfortably. Who stayed awake rewriting investor decks for your startup? Ruth, who paid your debts? His jaw flexed harder. Who protected your ego every single day while slowly destroying herself? Stop acting like I forced you to do those things. There it was. The selfishness underneath everything. Men like Zane love sacrifice as long as they never had to acknowledge its cost. Ruth felt anger pulse hotter through her body now. I had stitches healing after childbirth, while answering work emails because we needed stability. Her voice trembled. I pumped milk in office bathrooms while still outperforming half your company. You're spiraling. No, she snapped suddenly. I'm finally remembering who the hell I was before I started making myself smaller for you. Lily stirred softly in the crib. Instantly, Ruth lowered her voice again. Even in heartbreak, motherhood remained instinctive. Zane watched her carefully then, and for the first time Ruth saw it clearly. Not guilt, fear. Because the version of Ruth he depended on was disappearing. The exhausted woman begging for reassurance. The wife absorbing humiliation quietly. The woman willing to survive on crumbs of affection. Gone. You think this company is going to fix how miserable you are, he asked coldly. Ruth stared at him. Miserable, she repeated softly. You haven't been happy in a long time. The audacity almost impressed her. He cheated on her and still wanted emotional credit for her sadness. You know what's funny, Ruth whispered. I actually believed something was wrong with me. His expression flickered slightly. I thought motherhood broke me somehow. I thought maybe I became less lovable. Ruth. But the entire time she continued, tears burning. Now you were just giving what belonged to me to somebody else. Zane exhaled sharply. This isn't about Natalie. That lie was almost insulting. Ruth folded her arms tightly around herself. Then tell me what it's about. Silence. Long, heavy. Finally he muttered, You changed. There it was, the truth hiding beneath all the manipulation. Ruth waited. You used to be ambitious, he continued carefully. Sharp. Driven. I built my entire career while pregnant. That's not what I mean. Then explain it better. His eyes darkened with frustration. You became consumed by being a mother. The word settled into the nursery like poison. Consumed. As if loving their daughter too fully became some kind of failure. Ruth looked toward Lily sleeping peacefully in her crib, then back at her husband. No, she said quietly. I became consumed by surviving. Something cracked across Zane's face then, briefly, almost hidden, not remorse, recognition, because deep down he knew exactly how much Ruth carried alone, and he let her. Worse, he benefited from it. Zane ran a hand through his hair roughly. You have no idea how much pressure I've been under at Holloway. Ruth blinked slowly. There it was again. His suffering somehow always arrived to erase hers. Pressure, she whispered. You think I wanted any of this? Did you want Natalie? He flinched. Finally. Real silence flooded the room now. No manipulation, no polished corporate language, no emotional redirection. Just truth standing naked between them. Ruth felt strangely calm, devastated, yes, but calm. Do you love her? She asked. Zane looked away instantly, and somehow that hurt more than a yes, because it meant he didn't even respect Ruth enough to answer honestly. I didn't plan for this to happen. Classic coward language. Affairs always happen to people unwilling to admit they made choices. Ruth nodded slowly. You know what the saddest part is? What I would have forgiven almost anything if you had just been honest with me. That shook him visibly. Because it was true. Ruth loved him deeply once, enough to rebuild together, enough to survive hardship. But deception destroys intimacy faster than betrayal itself. Zane's voice softened now, almost desperate. You're exhausted, you're hurt, don't make permanent decisions because of emotions. Emotions. Always emotions. Never instincts. Never evidence. Never betrayal. Just female irrationality. Ruth walked toward the nursery door and opened it calmly. I'm done letting people weaponize my emotions against me. Zane didn't move. You're really going through with this company? Ruth met his eyes fully then, and for the first time in years she saw him clearly insecure, selfish, deeply threatened by her independence. Not powerful, just frightened. Yes, she answered. You'll fail. The cruelty came instantly once manipulation stopped working. There he was, the real man underneath the charm. Ruth surprised herself by smiling faintly. Maybe. Zane stared at her confused by the lack of fear. But if I fail, she continued softly, at least it'll be while building my own life, instead of financing everyone else's. His face hardened completely now. You're being reckless. No. Ruth shook her head slowly. I was reckless when I trusted people who only loved me when I was useful. Silence. Then finally, you didn't destroy me, Zane. Her voice stayed heartbreakingly calm. You trained me. And for the first time since the affair began, Zane looked genuinely afraid of the woman standing in front of him. The morning of Ruth's pitch to Ava Bennett, Lily threw up on her blazer 20 minutes before the meeting. Ruth stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen wearing cream slacks and only one earring, while warm formula dripped down the front of her jacket. For a second, exhaustion almost swallowed her whole. Of course this would happen today. Of course. The universe seemed determined to remind her that she was still a sleep-deprived mother, trying to rebuild a destroyed life with shaking hands. Lily immediately started crying, two tiny cheeks red with distress. And suddenly, Ruth wanted to cry with her, not because of the spit-up, because she was tired of trying to look composed while surviving emotional warfare. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Tyler, you're going to destroy this meeting. Relax. Ruth laughed softly despite herself. That tiny moment of support steadied her enough to breathe again. 20 minutes later, she sat in the back seat of a rideshare heading toward Manhattan, while reapplying mascara using her phone camera. Dark circles still shadowed her eyes. Her body still felt foreign after childbirth, but underneath the exhaustion, something else existed now. Focus. Burns Creative Group officially launched 48 hours earlier. No glamorous opening, no champagne, no polished office reveal. Just Ruth signing incorporation documents at 3 a.m. while breastfeeding her daughter between conference calls, yet somehow it already felt more real than her marriage. The rideshare stopped outside Bennett Living headquarters just after 10. The building towered above Manhattan like polished glass ambition. Ruth remembered walking through those same doors years earlier beside Graham Holloway while executives praised his leadership for ideas Ruth personally created. Back then she accepted invisibility as part of success, not anymore. As the elevator climbed upward, her stomach twisted violently. What if Ava changed her mind? What if this entire thing collapsed publicly? What if Zane was right? The thought angered her instantly. No. She refused to let his voice become the narrator inside her head anymore. The conference room doors opened. Ava Bennett stood immediately when Ruth entered. And for one shocking moment, Ava crossed the room and hugged her. Not professionally, genuinely. I'm so glad you came. Ruth nearly forgot how to breathe. Women in corporate spaces were rarely treated gently unless they became useful again. That simple kindness almost undid her. Thank you for meeting me, Ruth said carefully. Ava studied her face for a moment too long. You look exhausted. Ruth smiled faintly. I have a newborn and a public career collapse happening simultaneously. Ava laughed softly. Honestly, that sounds very female executive in America. The honesty relaxed Ruth slightly. They sat across from each other at the long conference table while city sunlight poured through the windows. For a moment, Ruth's old instincts returned automatically. Speak carefully, minimize emotion, stay agreeable. Then she stopped herself. No more shrinking. She opened her presentation slowly. Burns' creative group is built around one core belief. She began steadily. People can tell when companies stop seeing human beings and start seeing market segments. Ava leaned back immediately interested. Good, Ruth continued. No rehearsed corporate jargon. No fake motivational language. Just truth. She spoke about emotional authenticity, ethical storytelling, audience fatigue with manipulation, brands reconnecting through honesty instead of performance. And somewhere around slide 7, Ruth stopped feeling afraid, because this was the part of herself nobody could take away. Not Graham, not Zane, not Natalie. Talent survives betrayal. Ava interrupted halfway through. You know what's fascinating? Ruth paused. What, you sound alive again? The words hit unexpectedly hard. Alive. Not emotional, not unstable, not overwhelmed. Alive. Ruth looked down briefly, gathering herself. I think I forgot what that felt like. Ava's expression softened. I heard rumors about what happened at Holloway. Rumors. Always rumors before truth. Ruth held her posture carefully. I'm sure there are many versions. There are. Ava's tone sharpened slightly, most of them insulting. Anger flickered through Ruth's chest. Of course they were already framing her as unstable. Women were easiest to erase once labeled emotional. Ava leaned forward now. For the record, I don't believe any of it. Silence settled between them. Ruth suddenly realized how starved she'd become for people who simply believed her. Ava closed the proposal folder slowly. How quickly can you take over our national campaign? Ruth blinked. What, I'm serious. Ava, Burns' creative group is basically me, Tyler in a tiny rented office with terrible lighting. Ava smiled. I'm not hiring furniture. I'm hiring vision. Emotion rose painfully inside Ruth's throat. This was the first time since giving birth that someone looked at her like expansion instead of inconvenience. She swallowed hard. We could begin transition immediately. Good, Ava extended her hand across the table. And just like that, the first major client left Holloway and Pierce. Ruth shook her hand carefully, pulse racing beneath her skin. Not revenge, not yet, but validation. And after months of humiliation, validation felt intoxicating. An hour later, Ruth walked out of Bennett Living feeling almost weightless. The cold Manhattan wind hit her face sharply as she stepped onto the sidewalk. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't look empty. It looked terrifying, which was strangely better. Her phone exploded with incoming notifications before she even reached the corner. Tyler. Oh my God, did she sign Daniel? Please tell me you're celebrating. Unknown number. Ruth frowned and answered cautiously. Hello, Ruth. Graham Holloway. Her spine stiffened immediately. I heard you met with Ava Bennett today, he said coldly. That answered one question. Corporate panic traveled fast. Ruth continued walking calmly through Manhattan crowds. Yes, you moved quickly. Interesting. Not congratulations, not good for you, only suspicion. Because people like Graham believed ambition belonged exclusively to men until women used it against them. You fired me, Ruth replied evenly. I updated my resume. His silence sharpened. Then, you're making this personal. Ruth actually stopped walking. The audacity stunned her. Personal. He fired a postpartum woman on her first day back while helping cover her husband's affair, and she was making it personal. A slow, dangerous calm spread through her body. No, she said quietly. I think you just got very comfortable assuming I would stay broken. Graham's voice hardened. Holloway and Pierce built your reputation. Ruth looked up at the towering Manhattan skyline around her. Funny. For years she believed that too. Now she realized something important. Women are often taught to thank institutions for opportunities they personally earned. No, Ruth answered softly. I built your campaigns. Silence. Then the line disconnected. Ruth stared at the dead phone screen for a second before laughing quietly to herself. Not hysterically, not bitterly. Just free. Meanwhile, 30 blocks away inside Holloway and Pierce headquarters, Graham stormed into the executive conference room where Natalie and Zane were reviewing quarterly projections. She signed Bennett. Natalie's face drained instantly. What Zane looked up sharply. No. Graham slammed the folder onto the table. Yes. For the first time, genuine panic entered the room. Because Bennett Living wasn't just another account, it was their largest client. And worse, it publicly legitimized Ruth. Natalie folded her arms tightly. She's doing this to punish us. Graham looked furious enough to shatter glass. She's turning this personal. But deep down, all three of them understood the terrifying truth. Ruth Burns was no longer begging to stay in rooms where she wasn't valued. Now she was building rooms people wanted to follow her into. The rumors started quietly. That was how women were usually destroyed in corporate America, not through facts, through whispers. Ruth noticed it first when an old industry acquaintance abruptly stopped replying to her emails. Then another, then another. 3 days later, Tyler walked into the tiny Burns Creative Group office carrying coffee and tension. His expression alone told her something was wrong. What happened? Ruth asked immediately. Tyler hesitated too long. Tyler. He set the coffee down carefully. Natalie's talking. Ruth leaned back slowly in her chair. Of course she was. Natalie Cross was the kind of woman who weaponized polished femininity expertly, the kind who smiled while cutting someone open socially. What's she saying? Tyler looked uncomfortable. That you've been unstable since childbirth. The words hit harder than Ruth expected, not because they were surprising, because they were believable. That was the cruel genius of misogyny. A tired mother automatically looked emotional to people already searching for reasons not to take her seriously. Tyler continued carefully. She's implying the company let you go because clients were uncomfortable with your behavior. Ruth stared at the wall behind him. Behavior. Another vague accusation that somehow only destroyed women. Not performance, not competence. Behavior. She suddenly remembered every moment she cried privately after giving birth. Every exhausted mistake. Every emotional breakdown hidden in bathrooms and parked cars. What if everyone already saw her as fragile? Tyler's voice softened. Hey. Ruth blinked. You know none of that is true. But that wasn't the point. The terrifying thing about public narratives wasn't truth. It was repetition. Ruth looked around the tiny office, folding chairs, half-assembled desks, unpacked boxes, breast pump equipment hidden beside legal documents. Somewhere between motherhood and betrayal, her confidence had become frighteningly easy to bruise. Her phone buzzed. Daniel. Perfect timing. Ruth answered immediately. Tell me you didn't see the article, Daniel said. Her stomach dropped. What article? Silence. Then don't look it up. Too late. Ruth opened her laptop instantly and typed Holloway and Pierce into the search bar. A business gossip blog appeared immediately. Insiders claim former executive Ruth Burns struggled after maternity leave. Her chest tightened violently. The article danced carefully around direct accusations while implying everything: emotional instability, performance decline, difficulty adjusting after childbirth, erratic leadership. No names quoted directly. Cowards rarely sign their cruelty publicly. Tyler swore quietly under his breath. Ruth kept reading even though every sentence felt like swallowing glass. One line nearly stopped her breathing completely. Sources claim Burns had difficulty separating personal emotions from professional responsibilities after becoming a mother. Ruth shut the laptop instantly. The room blurred, not because she believed them, because she knew exactly how many people would. Women were expected to survive childbirth gracefully and silently. If they struggled visibly, society punished them for honesty. Daniel's voice sharpened through the phone. Ruth, listen to me carefully. She swallowed hard. This is retaliation, he continued. They're trying to discredit you before your company gains momentum. I know. Know you know emotionally. I need you to understand strategically. Ruth closed her eyes. Exhaustion pressed against her bones like concrete. How am I supposed to fight this while barely sleeping? You fight it one step at a time. Simple advice. Almost stupidly simple. Yet suddenly it felt possible. One step. Not the whole future. Just the next step. After the call ended, Ruth sat motionless while Tyler watched her carefully. You okay, no? Not even close. But Ruth realized something important, that nobody was coming to rescue her emotionally anymore. She either learned how to stand inside discomfort, or she disappeared beneath it. I need every email Holloway ever sent questioning my maternity leave, she said quietly. Tyler blinked, then slowly smiled. There she is. That afternoon became war preparation. Not glamorous, not cinematic, just brutal, exhausting documentation. Ruth and Tyler spread papers across folding tables while Lily slept in a portable bassinet beside them. Corporate emails, performance reviews, internal memos, and slowly a pattern emerged. Before maternity leave, exceptional leadership, irreplaceable strategist, future partner track. After childbirth, concerns about availability, concerns about emotional balance, concerns about brand alignment. Ruth stared at the language in disbelief. Women were never directly punished for motherhood anymore. Modern discrimination was subtler, polished, corporate cruelty, wearing HR-approved vocabulary. At 6 that evening, Sophia Lane arrived unexpectedly. Ruth almost didn't recognize her outside Holloway and Pierce. Without perfect makeup and executive posture, Sophia looked exhausted, guilty. Tyler immediately tensed. What is she doing here? Sophia looked directly at Ruth. I need 5 minutes. Ruth hesitated before nodding. Tyler reluctantly stepped outside. Silence filled the tiny office once they were alone. Sophia glanced toward Lily sleeping nearby. She's beautiful. Ruth's voice remained careful. Why are you here? Sophia looked down briefly. Because this has gone too far. Something inside Ruth sharpened immediately. What does that mean? Sophia opened her leather bag slowly and removed a folder. I shouldn't be giving you this. Ruth took the folder carefully. Inside were printed internal messages. Her pulse quickened instantly. Graham clients respond better to Natalie's image lately. Another Ruth may not fit the post-maternity executive direction we need. Another motherhood has clearly shifted her priorities. Ruth's stomach twisted, not because she didn't know they believed those things, because seeing them written down made the humiliation real in a new way. Sophia looked sick with guilt. I argued against the termination. Ruth looked up sharply. You did? Yes. Sophia's voice cracked slightly, but Graham already decided. Why help me now? Sophia laughed bitterly. Because I watched an entire company convince itself destroying one exhausted mother was just business. Silence settled heavily between them. Then Sophia added quietly, and because I know what happens when powerful men realize kind women won't stay quiet anymore. Ruth felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside her chest. Not weakness. Recognition. Women surviving systems designed to exhaust them. Sophia stood slowly. There's more coming. Ruth frowned. What do you mean Natalie's pushing harder internally? They want investors believing you're emotionally unstable before Burns' creative gains traction. Of course. If Ruth succeeded publicly, their entire narrative collapsed. Sophia moved toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, she said softly, everyone knows Holloway lost something valuable when they lost you. After she left, Ruth remained frozen in her chair. The office suddenly felt too small for all the rage building inside her. Lily stirred softly in the bassinet. Instantly, Ruth picked her up, holding her close against her chest, while breathing shakily into her daughter's hair. Motherhood. They kept using that word like a weakness. But motherhood was the reason Ruth survived this at all. Without Lily, maybe she would have stayed small forever. Tyler re-entered carefully. How bad Ruth looked up slowly. Then she handed him the folder. His face darkened more with every page. These people are disgusting. Ruth's voice stayed strangely calm now. No. Tyler blinked. They're terrified. That realization changed everything, because suddenly the smear campaign didn't feel powerful anymore. It felt desperate. Late that night, Daniel arrived carrying takeout and legal documents. He spread papers across the conference table carefully. We're sending formal notice tomorrow. Ruth stared at him. Already they drew first blood publicly. Daniel's expression hardened. So now we remind them, you have evidence. For a moment, fear crawled back into Ruth's chest. Legal battles, public scrutiny, more humiliation. Daniel noticed immediately. You don't have to be fearless, he said quietly. You just have to stop apologizing for being hurt. That sentence shattered something open inside her. Because for months, years, Ruth kept translating betrayal into personal failure. Maybe she wasn't pretty enough, supportive enough, easy enough. Now she finally understood people who exploit your kindness will always call your pain an inconvenience. Ruth looked down at Lily sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. Then back at the legal notice waiting beside Daniel's pen. Slowly, she signed her name, and somewhere across Manhattan Holloway and Pierce still believed they were dealing with a broken woman. They had no idea they were creating one who had finally stopped being afraid. The recording became the beginning of the end, not just for Holloway and Pierce, for Ruth's marriage too. 3 days after Daniel sent the formal legal notice, the company's executive floor felt like a luxury hotel during a fire alarm-controlled panic hidden beneath expensive suits. Ruth knew because Tyler still had friends inside. "Graham's losing his mind," Tyler said while pacing the tiny Burns creative office. "HR is scrambling. Investors are asking questions." Ruth sat quietly at the conference table feeding Lily from a bottle. Her daughter's tiny fingers wrapped around Ruth's thumb while corporate chaos unfolded 30 blocks away. The contrast felt surreal. One moment she was sterilizing baby bottles. The next she was preparing for legal warfare. Daniel arrived carrying another stack of files in his usual exhausted Manhattan energy. "You ready?" he asked. "No, absolutely not," but Ruth nodded anyway. "Because healing doesn't wait until women feel prepared." Daniel connected his laptop to the office television screen. "I reviewed the recordings carefully," he said. "There's enough here to establish discriminatory intent." Ruth's stomach tightened instantly. Even now, hearing the evidence replayed felt unbearable. Daniel clicked play. Static filled the room first. Then Graham's voice. "She's become too emotionally unpredictable after childbirth." Ruth physically flinched. Tyler muttered, "Jesus Christ." Another recording followed, this one worse. Zane's voice drifted through the speakers casually, almost bored. "Honestly, clients respond better to Natalie now." Ruth stopped breathing. Daniel paused the recording immediately. "You okay? No, not even remotely." Because hearing betrayal privately was one thing, hearing it documented permanently was another. Ruth stared at the dark television screen. "That's my husband," she whispered faintly. "Not was. Is. The grief of loving someone cruel doesn't disappear immediately just because truth arrives." Daniel hesitated carefully. "There's more." Ruth closed her eyes briefly. "Play it." The next recording shattered whatever remained of her denial. Graham's voice. "You think Ruth suspects anything?" Zane laughed softly. "She's too exhausted to notice." Ruth's chest tightened violently. Too exhausted to notice. Not too stupid, not too emotional, too exhausted. Because exhaustion had become her entire identity to them. The tired wife, the overwhelmed mother, the woman too depleted to fight back. Meanwhile, she was carrying a newborn, a collapsing marriage, postpartum depression, and an entire company emotionally. Daniel paused again, but Ruth shook her head. "Keep going." Another voice. "Natalie, she doesn't exactly scream executive presence anymore." Laughter followed. Ruth looked away sharply. Something about women mocking other women hurt differently. Natalie knew what motherhood cost professionally, and she still helped weaponize it. Then came the final recording, the one that truly destroyed everything. Zane sighed heavily in the audio. "I know this sounds terrible, but after the baby..." Silence. "She stopped feeling like my wife." The room went still. Ruth's heartbeat became deafening. Graham answered carefully, meaning another pause, then Zane said quietly, "She became someone's mother before she stayed my partner." Ruth's eyes filled instantly, not because she still wanted him, but because she finally understood something horrifying. Zane resented her for loving Lily fully, for changing, for sacrificing, for becoming less centered around him. And suddenly every cruel little moment made sense, the emotional distance, the affair, the irritation, the criticism, the withdrawal. He didn't cheat because Ruth became unlovable. He cheated because motherhood forced him to stop being the center of her universe. Daniel immediately shut the recording off. Silence crashed heavily into the office. Tyler looked furious enough to punch a wall, but Ruth just sat there unmoving, while Lily slept peacefully against her shoulder. Women survive unbearable things quietly every day. That was the terrifying truth. Finally, Daniel spoke carefully. "Ruth." She wiped her face quickly before tears fully fell. "I'm okay. Lie." Daniel's expression softened painfully. "No, you're not." And somehow hearing someone say it kindly almost broke her more than the betrayal itself. because she spent so long pretending survival wasn't hurting her. Ruth stood abruptly and walked toward the office window, Manhattan blurred below through rain-streaked glass. For several seconds, she simply breathed. Then I actually believed him. Daniel stayed silent. When he said I changed, her voice cracked now. I spent months staring at myself in mirrors, wondering what became so hard to love. Emotion thickened painfully in her throat. I thought maybe I stopped being attractive enough, fun enough. Tyler looked devastated listening to her. Ruth laughed bitterly through tears. But I was literally recovering from childbirth while keeping everyone alive. That was the cruelty of emotional manipulation. Women were taught to internalize abandonment as personal failure, instead of recognizing selfishness in others. Daniel approached carefully. What Zane said reflects him, not you. Ruth nodded faintly. Intellectually, she understood that. Emotionally was harder, because some wounds settle directly into identity. Her phone buzzed suddenly on the table. Zane. The timing almost felt cinematic. Ruth stared at the screen while it rang, then answered, "What?" His voice sounded tense immediately. "You filed legal action straight to business." "Of course." "No, how are you? No, can we talk?" "Just fear, yes." "Ruth, are you seriously trying to destroy everything?" She laughed softly in disbelief. "Destroy?" Interesting word choice from a man who detonated his own marriage. "You did that yourself. This has gone too far." "No," Ruth said quietly. "Actually, this is the first honest thing happening." Silence. Then Zane lowered his voice carefully into that manipulative softness she once mistook for love. "You're angry right now." Ruth closed her eyes briefly. There it was again. Female emotion used to invalidate female reality. "I'm awake right now," she corrected. Another silence. "Then you're embarrassing yourself publicly." That one landed harder than he intended, because shame had always been Ruth's weakest point. Women are trained to fear public embarrassment more than private suffering. For years, she protected Zane's image even while drowning emotionally. Not anymore. Ruth looked down at Lily sleeping safely against her chest, then answered calmly, "I spent years embarrassing myself privately for your comfort. I'm done." His breathing sharpened. "You think these people actually care about you?" "No," Ruth whispered. "I think they underestimated me." She hung up before he could respond. The room remained silent afterward. Daniel finally exhaled slowly. He's scared. Good. For once, let him sit inside uncertainty. That evening, the story exploded internally across Holloway and Pierce. Executives whispered behind closed doors. HR scrambled through archived communications, investors demanded emergency calls, and Natalie Cross finally understood the terrifying reality unfolding around her. Ruth Burns was not disappearing quietly. Meanwhile, Ruth sat alone in the nursery later that night, while Lily slept in her arms. The house felt emotionally abandoned now. Zane hadn't come home yet, or maybe he was avoiding her downstairs. Either way, the silence no longer hurt like it once did. Ruth looked around the nursery, slowly scattered stuffed animals, folded baby blankets, unfinished bottles, legal paperwork beside diapers. Her life existed in pieces right now. Motherhood, grief, revenge, healing, all tangled together messily, but beneath the heartbreak, something else had started growing. Self-respect, the kind born only after survival becomes unbearable. Her phone buzzed one final time before midnight, this time from Daniel. "We're ready to proceed with divorce filings whenever you are." Ruth stared at the message for a long time. 7 years of marriage, gone. No dramatic collapse, no screaming, just accumulated betrayals finally becoming impossible to survive politely. Lily shifted softly against her chest. Ruth kissed the top of her daughter's head carefully. Then she typed back 3 words. "Let's do it." And somewhere deep inside herself, Ruth realized something important. The most dangerous moment in a woman's life is not when she's betrayed. It's when she finally stops begging people to love her correctly. The boardroom looked exactly the same. That was the first thing Ruth noticed. Same polished walnut table, same floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, same cold air conditioning that always made women bring sweaters, while men sat comfortably in expensive suits. 3 months ago, she sat in this room leaking breast milk through her blouse while Graham Holloway erased her career. Today, she walked in wearing a charcoal gray tailored coat with Lily's tiny sock still hidden inside her purse for luck, and nobody looked relaxed anymore. Not Graham. Not the board members, not Natalie, especially not Zane. Ruth entered beside Daniel Mercer and two investors from Burns Creative Group. Tyler followed, carrying presentation folders, while assistants hurried nervously around the room. Power had shifted quietly while everyone underestimated her. The board chairwoman, Cynthia Vale, stood immediately. "Ms. Burns, thank you for coming." Interesting. 3 months ago she was emotionally compromised. Now she was Ms. Burns again. Respect always arrived late for women. Ruth nodded politely and sat across from Graham. He looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His tie sat crooked for the first time in years. "Good." Graham folded his hands carefully. "Before we begin, I want to say, the company regrets how certain transitions were handled." Transitions. Corporate language was fascinating. Affairs became personal complications. Discrimination became miscommunication. Destroying women became transitions. Ruth leaned back calmly. "No," she said softly. "You regret consequences." Silence spread instantly across the room. Daniel hid the faintest smile beside her. Cynthia cleared her throat awkwardly. Holloway and Pierce would like to discuss resolution options. Resolution. Another polished word. What they really meant was panic. Because Burns Creative Group was growing faster than anyone expected. Ava Bennett publicly praised Ruth in 2 interviews. Other clients followed quietly afterward, and worse for Holloway and Pierce. The lawsuit discovery process terrified them. Too many emails, too many recordings, too much proof. Natalie sat stiffly near the far end of the table, her perfect posture strained beneath pressure. For the first time since Ruth met her, Natalie looked uncertain. Not superior. Uncertain. Good. Graham slid a folder across the table. "We're prepared to offer you reinstatement." Tyler nearly choked beside Ruth. Daniel raised an eyebrow slowly. Ruth didn't touch the folder. Graham continued carefully. "Executive salary increase. Expanded leadership authority. Full public statement regarding restructuring misunderstandings." Misunderstandings. Ruth almost laughed. They destroyed her professionally, humiliated her postpartum, weaponized motherhood, against her helped cover her husband's affair. And now they wanted to call it a misunderstanding. Zane finally spoke for the first time. "Ruth, this could fix everything." She turned toward him slowly. Fix. Such an interesting word from a man who never repaired anything emotionally in his life. For a second she studied him carefully. He looked thinner lately, more tired. The confident charm that once filled rooms now looked strained around the edges. Pain had finally reached him too. Not enough, but some. Ruth folded her hands calmly on the table. "I have a question." Cynthia nodded quickly. "Of course. Which part exactly are you trying to fix silence?" Ruth's voice remained quiet. "The part where I was fired after maternity leave." Nobody answered. The part where internal emails questioned my value after childbirth. Natalie looked down immediately. The part where executives discussed replacing me because motherhood damaged your executive image. Graham's jaw tightened visibly. Still, Ruth continued. Or maybe she was finally done protecting powerful people from discomfort. The part where my husband helped facilitate my replacement while sleeping with a coworker that detonated the room. Natalie's face drained white instantly. One board member muttered, "Jesus Christ!" Zane looked horrified. Not guilty, horrified. Because public truth embarrassed him more than private betrayal ever had. Ruth leaned back slowly. "You're not offering me justice," she said calmly. "You're offering damage control." Cynthia looked deeply uncomfortable now. "We understand emotions are involved," Ruth laughed softly. There it was again. Emotions. Women could present evidence recordings, documentation, legal filings, and still men reduced everything to emotion once accountability became inconvenient. "No," Ruth interrupted gently. "Evidence is involved." Daniel slid several printed documents across the table. Discovery summaries, internal messages, client transitions, reality. The room became very quiet. Graham's expression hardened completely. "You're enjoying this." Ruth blinked slowly. Interesting accusation, as if women achieving consequences after mistreatment somehow became cruelty. "No," she answered honestly. "I'm healing from it." That answer unsettled him more. Because rage he could understand. Healing threatened him. Ruth opened the reinstatement folder finally. Executive partner track. Public image rehabilitation campaign. Financial incentives. Months ago, this offer would have felt like salvation. Now it felt insulting. She closed the folder carefully. No. The single word landed heavily. Cynthia frowned. Ms. Burns, I strongly encourage you to reconsider. Holloway & Pierce remains one of the most influential firms in the country. Ruth nodded politely, and Burns Creative remains mine. That silence afterward felt different. Not fear, recognition. For the first time, everyone in that room understood something important. Ruth no longer needed validation from institutions that failed her. Graham leaned forward sharply. You think your little startup survives long-term competition? Ah, there he was. The real Graham Holloway, not regretful executive, not diplomatic negotiator, just another powerful man furious a woman refused to stay grateful after being mistreated. Ruth met his gaze steadily. You know what's fascinating? His expression darkened. For years I thought Holloway & Pierce made me successful. Her voice remained calm. Then I left and your clients followed me anyway. No one spoke, because everyone knew it was true. The boardroom doors opened suddenly. An assistant hurried inside looking panicked. Sorry to interrupt, but the Harper account just called. Graham looked irritated. What now? The assistant swallowed hard. They're terminating their contract. Another silence. Then, they signed with Burns Creative this morning. Tyler looked down immediately, trying not to smile. Daniel failed completely and smirked openly. Natalie's face looked genuinely frightened now. The room shifted emotionally in real time. Not toward Graham, toward Ruth. Power always moves quietly before people admit it moved at all. Cynthia exhaled slowly. Ms. Burns, what exactly do you want? The question hung heavily between them. Months ago, Ruth would have answered differently. An apology, maybe. Recognition. Love. Now she looked around the boardroom carefully. The same room where she once sat humiliated and discarded. Then she answered honestly. I want women after me treated like human beings instead of liabilities. No one spoke. Ruth continued softly. I want mothers allowed to return to work without being punished for giving birth. Her voice remained heartbreakingly steady now. And I want every person in this room to understand something very clearly. She stood slowly. The entire boardroom watched her. You only respect women after failing to destroy them. Silence crashed across the table. Even Graham looked shaken now. Because the worst part, he knew she was right. Ruth gathered her coat calmly. Daniel rose beside her. Tyler followed, carrying folders. As she reached the door, Zane spoke quietly behind her. Ruth. She stopped, but didn't turn around. His voice sounded smaller now. I never thought it would become this. Slowly, Ruth looked back over her shoulder, neither cruel nor emotional, just honest. That's because you never thought I'd survive it. Then she walked out of the boardroom that once humiliated her, and this time nobody looked away while she left. Zane finally understood what loss felt like the day Natalie stopped answering his calls. Not during the lawsuit, not when clients left Holloway & Pierce, not even when Ruth walked out of the boardroom without looking back. No, it happened on a gray Thursday evening while he sat alone in his luxury apartment surrounded by silence, so thick it almost sounded alive. Because Natalie had disappeared the moment his status cracked. Just like Ruth had once warned him people eventually do when love is built on convenience. The apartment smelled faintly like whiskey and expensive cologne. Rain hammered softly against the windows overlooking Manhattan, while unopened emails crowded Zane's phone screen. Investor concerns, internal investigations, board reviews. Everything was collapsing at once now. And for the first time in years, nobody was standing beside him absorbing the emotional damage quietly. Ruth used to do that. God, Ruth used to do everything. Zane rubbed both hands over his face roughly. The terrifying part wasn't losing the marriage. It was realizing how much of his stability had actually been Ruth all along. She handled emotional crises, finances, during his failures, social relationships, domestic life, career support, even his confidence. And he repaid her by making her feel unlovable after childbirth. The realization sat like poison inside him now. His phone buzzed again. Natalie. Instantly he answered. Finally. Her voice sounded irritated immediately. You can't keep calling me. Zane blinked in disbelief. What? This situation has become toxic. Toxic. Funny word from the woman who helped destroy his wife. You think he snapped? Natalie sighed heavily. The board is watching everything now. There it was. Not concern for Ruth. Not guilt. Reputation management. Zane suddenly heard Ruth's voice in his head. You only cared about me when I was useful. A chill crawled through him. Natalie, I think we need distance for a while. Distance. Corporate people loved soft words for abandonment. Are you serious right now? This isn't a good time emotionally. Emotionally. The irony almost made him laugh. Then she added the sentence that finally shattered whatever illusion remained. I didn't sign up to become the villain in somebody else's revenge story. The line disconnected before he could answer. Zane stared at the dead screen. Slowly, painfully, humiliation spread through his chest. Because now he understood what Ruth felt in that boardroom. Disposable. Meanwhile, across Connecticut, Ruth sat cross-legged on the floor of Lily's nursery building, a toy castle, while her daughter laughed uncontrollably. The sound filled the room warmly, purely. And for the first time in months, Ruth laughed too. Not performatively, not carefully, genuinely. Lily grabbed Ruth's finger with tiny hands, while sunlight spilled softly through the nursery curtains. Peace, small, fragile, but real. Her phone buzzed nearby with another client confirmation for Burns' creative group. Tyler was right. Momentum was accelerating fast now. Women-led brands especially wanted Ruth after the Holloway scandal became public. Quietly, privately, female executives started reaching out with their own stories fired after pregnancies, pushed out after maternity leave labeled emotional for setting boundaries. Ruth read every message carefully, not because she enjoyed their pain, because she recognized it. The hidden exhaustion women carried while pretending professionalism. A knock sounded downstairs. Ruth checked the security camera monitor and froze slightly. Zane. Rain poured around him heavily while he stood outside the house looking soaked and exhausted. For a second, old instincts rose automatically worry. Guilt responsibility. Then Ruth remembered Natalie wearing her necklace, the recordings, the humiliation, him calling her dead weight. The guilt disappeared. Slowly she stood and carried Lily downstairs. When Ruth opened the front door, cold rain air rushed inside immediately. Zane looked terrible. Not movie star terrible, actually terrible. Dark circles, wrinkled clothes, hollow eyes. Pain had finally reached his face. Can I come in? He asked quietly. Ruth looked at him for several seconds, then stepped aside silently. He entered carefully like a man walking through ruins he personally created. The house felt different now. Lighter somehow, because Ruth no longer spent every second emotionally managing him. Zane noticed immediately, too. His eyes drifted across Lily's toys, Burns' creative folders, fresh flowers on the counter, signs of life returning. You redecorated. No, Ruth answered calmly. I started living here again. That hit him. Good. Zane looked toward Lily in Ruth's arms. She's gotten bigger. The sadness in his voice almost sounded real. Ruth adjusted Lily gently against her shoulder. That's what happens when you miss things. Silence. Rain tapped against the windows, while tension filled the kitchen quietly. Finally, Zane spoke. Natalie left. Ruth blinked once and felt absolutely nothing. That surprised her most. Months ago, the information would have devastated her emotionally. Now, just emptiness. I'm sorry to hear that, she said politely. The politeness hurt him more than anger. I deserve that, he muttered. No, he deserved worse. But Ruth was too tired to deliver punishment anymore. Zane looked around slowly before whispering, I ruined everything. Ruth leaned against the kitchen counter carefully. No, she corrected softly. You ruined what benefited you. His eyes filled immediately. Interesting. Men often discover emotional depth only after consequences arrive personally. I didn't understand what I was doing, he admitted shakily. Ruth almost laughed. You absolutely did. The honesty stunned him silent. She continued quietly. You knew every time you lied to me, every time you touched her, every time you watched me struggle alone with Lily. Tears slid down Zane's face now. Real tears, not manipulative ones. And somehow that made Ruth sadder than angry. Because once upon a time she would have done anything to save this man from pain. Now she simply couldn't reach him emotionally anymore. You know what the worst part is, he whispered. Ruth waited. I never thought you'd survive without me. There it was, the deepest truth underneath everything. Not love, ego. He genuinely believed Ruth needed him more than he needed her. That belief gave him permission to betray her safely. Ruth looked down at Lily playing sleepily with the fabric of her sweater, then back at Zane. You confused my loyalty with weakness. His face crumpled completely. I loved you. The sentence echoed painfully through the kitchen, because maybe he did, in his own damaged, selfish way. But love without respect eventually becomes cruelty. Ruth's voice softened despite herself. I know. That answer destroyed him more than screaming would have, because hatred still contains attachment. Understanding does not. Zane stepped closer carefully. Can we fix this? Ruth looked at him for a long moment. The rain outside, the quiet house, the man she once planned forever with standing broken in front of her. And suddenly she realized something important. She wasn't angry anymore, just done. No, she whispered gently. His eyes closed immediately like the word physically hurt. Ruth continued carefully. I mourned this marriage long before we filed papers. Silence. Then Lily yawned softly against Ruth's shoulder. Such a tiny human. Yet somehow she became the reason Ruth finally chose herself. Zane wiped his face roughly. I don't know who I am without you. The confession sounded terrifyingly honest. Ruth did know. That was the difference now. Pain forced her to meet herself again, and while the process nearly destroyed her, it also saved her. Zane looked around the house one final time, at the warmth returning slowly without him, then finally whispered, I lost the best thing that ever happened to me. Ruth felt tears sting unexpectedly, not because she wanted him back, because once a long time ago she believed he would never say something like that too late. He moved toward the door slowly. Before leaving, he turned back once more. I really am sorry. Ruth nodded softly, and for the first time in years she understood something freeing. An apology does not always rebuild love. Sometimes it simply confirms the ending was necessary. The rain started again the night Zane asked Ruth to meet him one last time. Not at their house, not at a lawyer's office, at the small Italian restaurant where he proposed to her 8 years earlier. Ruth almost declined immediately, but something inside her needed closure more than avoidance. So 2 nights later she sat alone near the restaurant window, wearing a black wool coat while candlelight flickered softly across white tablecloths around her. The place looked exactly the same. Same piano music, same wine racks, same golden lighting designed to make people believe love lasts forever. Ruth used to think romance meant permanence. Now she understood something different. Love without respect eventually turns into grief. The hostess approached gently. He's running a few minutes late. Of course he was. Zane had always assumed Ruth would wait for him emotionally. Tonight would be the last time. Outside the window, Manhattan blurred beneath rain and headlights. Couples hurried past holding umbrellas together, while laughter drifted softly through the restaurant. Once scenes like this made Ruth ache for romance. Now they mostly made her think about honesty. Real love wasn't grand gestures, it was consistency. Showing up, protecting each other, not abandoning someone the second life became inconvenient. 10 minutes later, Zane finally walked in, and Ruth barely recognized him. Not physically, emotionally. The arrogance was gone. No polished confidence, no charming ease, just exhaustion. He stopped beside the table quietly. Hey. Ruth nodded once. Hi. For a moment, neither moved. Then Zane sat across from her carefully like he was afraid sudden movement might shatter something fragile. Maybe it already had. The waiter approached awkwardly. Would you like wine? No, Ruth answered immediately. Zane gave a tired little smile. You always ordered the Cabernet here. I used to believe red wine fixed stress. What do you believe now? Ruth looked directly at him. That leaving unhealthy situations fixes stress. That landed. Good. The waiter disappeared quickly after taking minimal orders. Silence settled between them. Not angry silence anymore. Mourning silence. Zane rubbed his hands together nervously. I didn't think you'd come. I almost didn't. His eyes lowered. I deserve that. There was a time those words would have softened Ruth instantly. Now they simply sounded accurate. The piano music drifted softly through the restaurant, while candlelight flickered across Zane's tired face. Finally he spoke. I keep replaying everything. Ruth remained quiet. The affair, the company, the recordings. His voice cracked slightly. I don't even recognize myself anymore. Ruth almost answered immediately, but then she stopped. Because for years she interrupted her own pain to comfort his. No more. Zane swallowed hard. I was cruel to you. Yes, simple truth. Not complicated, not nuanced, cruel. You made me feel invisible, Ruth said softly. The honesty visibly hurt him. You know what I remember most, she continued quietly. Not even Natalie. Zane stared at her. It was all the tiny moments, her voice trembled slightly now. The nights I sat alone feeding Lily while you stayed out. The way you looked annoyed when I cried. The way you touched your phone more than you touched me. Tears filled his eyes instantly. Ruth looked away briefly toward the rain outside. I kept trying to become easier to love. That sentence nearly broke him, because he finally understood what his selfishness actually cost her psychologically. Zane wiped his face roughly. You were never hard to love. Ruth laughed softly. Funny. Men often become poets once women stop believing them. You know, she whispered, I spent months blaming my body after childbirth. His expression collapsed completely. I thought maybe I became too tired, too emotional, too maternal. Her throat tightened painfully. Meanwhile, you were cheating on me while I healed from giving birth to our daughter. Ruth, no. Her voice stayed calm. You need to hear it without escaping into guilt. Silence flooded the table again. For years, Ruth feared confrontation because she thought anger ruined relationships. Now she understood dishonesty, ruined them long before anger arrived. Zane looked shattered. I hated myself afterward. Not enough to stop. The brutal truth cut through him immediately. Again, good. Women were expected to cushion consequences emotionally for everyone. Ruth was done cushioning. Their food arrived untouched between them. Neither cared. Zane stared at his plate for several seconds before speaking again. The worst part is... He inhaled shakily. I was jealous of you. Ruth blinked. What? I know how insane that sounds. Yes, it did. You were smarter than me, he admitted quietly. More respected, more disciplined. Ruth stared at him in disbelief, and instead of being proud of you, his voice broke. I started resenting you. The confession settled heavily between them. Suddenly, so many things made sense. The subtle criticism, the emotional withdrawal, the affair with Natalie, the need to feel admired. Zane didn't betray Ruth because she lacked value. He betrayed her because her value exposed his insecurity. Ruth leaned back slowly. You punished me for carrying us. His eyes filled instantly. Yes, such a small word for such devastating truth. Ruth looked down at her hands resting quietly in her lap. No wedding ring anymore. The skin beneath it still looked pale. Strange how bodies remembered absence physically. I loved you, Zane whispered. She believed him. That was the tragedy. Love alone simply wasn't enough. Not without respect, not without loyalty, not without kindness. Ruth's voice softened. I know. Tears slid down his face openly now. I would do anything to fix this. There it was, the sentence she once dreamed of hearing. Too late, Ruth looked at him carefully and realized something surprising. She no longer wanted revenge. Not really. Watching him suffer didn't heal her. Healing healed her. That was the difference. You know when our marriage actually ended, she asked quietly. Zane shook his head slowly. The night I cried in the bathroom after Lily was born. His face tightened painfully. You walked past me without noticing. The memory haunted her still hospital lights, postpartum pain, blood exhaustion, and loneliness so deep it physically hurt. I realized then, Ruth whispered, that I could disappear emotionally beside you, and you wouldn't know until it affected your comfort. Zane covered his face briefly. I'm sorry. This time the apology sounded real, raw, human. But apologies arrive after damage, not instead of it. Ruth reached slowly into her coat pocket, then placed something carefully onto the table between them, her wedding ring. Zane stared at it like it might kill him. Ruth's voice remained heartbreakingly calm. I don't hate you. That almost hurt him more. Actually, she inhaled slowly. I think that's why this is over, because hate still burns. Ruth simply felt finished. The waitress approached cautiously. Would either of you like dessert? Neither answered immediately. Finally, Ruth smiled politely. No, thank you. The waitress disappeared again. Outside, rain continued washing across Manhattan streets. Zane stared at the ring silently, then finally whispered, I lost you long before the divorce papers. Ruth nodded faintly. Yes. And for the first time since all of this began, she didn't cry. Because grief eventually transforms into acceptance when women stop romanticizing pain as love. Ruth stood slowly, pulling her coat around herself. Zane looked up immediately. This is goodbye, isn't it? She considered the question honestly, then answered, No. He blinked. It's the first honest ending we've ever had. And somehow that hurt both of them most of all. The new Burns Creative Group headquarters smelled like fresh paint coffee and possibility. Ruth stood in the center of the open concept office one early Monday morning, while employees moved around her carrying laptops, plants, and half-unpacked boxes. Sunlight poured through massive industrial windows overlooking lower Manhattan. The polished concrete floors echoed with laughter and conversation instead of tension. No whispered cruelty, no corporate politics disguised as professionalism, no women apologizing for existing too loudly. For the first time in her career, Ruth had built something that felt emotionally safe, and somehow that mattered more than prestige now. Mommy Ruth turned just in time to see Lily toddling unsteadily across the office toward her in tiny yellow sneakers. The entire room immediately melted. Tyler looked up from the conference table and laughed. There goes our CEO. Lily crashed into Ruth's legs dramatically before raising both arms to be picked up. Ruth lifted her daughter, instantly kissing her cheek, while warmth spread through her chest. 6 months ago, she cried alone in nursery, darkness, wondering whether motherhood destroyed her life. Now her daughter wandered freely through the company Ruth rebuilt from betrayal. Healing looked strange sometimes, not glamorous, just peaceful. A young employee named Marisol approached, carrying onboarding folders nervously. Sorry to interrupt, but the new hires are ready whenever you are. Ruth smiled warmly. Perfect. As she carried Lily into the conference room, conversations quieted immediately. 7 women sat around the long oak table. Different ages, different backgrounds, yet all of them shared something invisible Ruth recognized. Instantly, exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion. The emotional kind women carried after spending years proving their worth in rooms determined to diminish them. Ruth looked around carefully before sitting at the head of the table. No corporate speeches today, she said gently. I just want to say one thing. Everyone listened closely. You do not have to earn basic human respect here. Silence. Heavy, emotional. One woman near the end of the table actually looked like she might cry. Ruth continued softly. You don't have to hide motherhood. You don't have to apologize for boundaries. And you do not have to destroy yourself to prove commitment. The room remained completely still, because every woman there understood exactly what she meant. Marisol finally whispered, I've never heard a boss say things like that before. Ruth smiled sadly. That's because too many workplaces benefit from women being emotionally exhausted. After the meeting ended, Tyler approached quietly, while Lily colored on legal documents nearby with washable crayons. We just crossed 30 employees. Ruth blinked. What? He grinned. Burns Creative officially outgrew startup territory. For a moment, Ruth simply stared around the office. 30 employees. 6 months earlier, she sat crying on a nursery floor, believing her life was over. Now women were rebuilding careers inside a company born from her pain. The irony felt almost cinematic. Her phone buzzed. Daniel. Ruth answered immediately. Please tell me you're sitting down. That tone meant trouble, or opportunity. With you, honestly, it could go either way. Daniel laughed softly. I just got off a call regarding Holloway and Pierce. Ruth's stomach tightened slightly despite herself. Some wounds still reacted automatically. What happened? A pause. Then, they're preparing for acquisition talks. Ruth blinked. What? The scandal hit harder than expected. Clients keep leaving. Investors want out. A strange emotion moved through her chest. Not satisfaction exactly. Something sadder. Because once upon a time Ruth loved that company too. Not the executives, the work, the creativity, the ambition. Women often grieve institutions that exploited them because they poured genuine pieces of themselves into building them. Daniel continued carefully. And before you ask, yes, they contacted us. Ruth froze. What for another pause? They want Burns Creative involved in negotiations. Tyler looked up instantly from across the office, what Ruth slowly sat down. This felt unreal. The company that fired her after maternity leave now wanted her at the negotiation table. Life really did have a twisted sense of humor. Later that evening, Ruth drove home beneath a soft orange sunset while Lily slept in the back seat. The old house no longer felt haunted. After the divorce finalized, Ruth redesigned almost everything lighter. Furniture, warm colors, photographs. She actually loved spaces that reflected peace instead of performance. Healing often begins physically first. You remove objects before emotional memories follow. As Ruth carried Lily inside, she noticed Eleanor Burns already sitting at the kitchen counter drinking tea. "Hey, sweetheart," Eleanor said warmly. That word still surprised Ruth every time. "Hi." Lily immediately squealed. Grandma Eleanor opened her arms instantly. Watching them together still made Ruth emotional sometimes, because Eleanor chose Ruth even after the marriage collapsed. That kind of loyalty mattered deeply now. "You look happy," Eleanor observed quietly while Lily played nearby. Ruth paused. Happy. Such a simple word, yet for years it felt unreachable. "I think I'm peaceful," Ruth answered honestly. Eleanor smiled softly. "That's usually healthier." Silence settled comfortably between them. Then Ruth finally said, "Holloway and Pierce is collapsing." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And how does that feel?" Interesting question. Months ago, Ruth fantasized about revenge constantly. Now she leaned against the counter thoughtfully. Honestly, she admitted. Mostly exhausting. Eleanor nodded knowingly. Revenge keeps people emotionally tied to pain. Ruth looked down at Lily building towers from wooden blocks on the floor. But healing doesn't. That night after Eleanor left, Ruth wandered slowly through the quiet house while Lily slept upstairs. The windows were open slightly, letting cool spring air drift through the rooms. Everything felt softer now. Not perfect. She still had scars, betrayal trauma, postpartum loneliness, trust issues, grief. Healing wasn't magical. It was gradual. But she no longer woke every morning feeling emotionally abandoned inside her own life. That mattered. Her phone buzzed near midnight, unknown number. Ruth almost ignored it before answering cautiously. "Hello?" A familiar voice responded quietly. "Ruth?" "Graham Holloway." "Interesting." Ruth sat down slowly in the living room chair. "What do you want?" For several seconds he didn't answer, and suddenly she realized something shocking. He sounded old, not powerful, not intimidating, just tired. "We'd like to formally invite Burns Creative to acquisition discussions." Ruth looked toward the staircase leading upstairs to Lily's room. Months ago, this man made her feel disposable. Now he was calling her home asking for help. Funny how quickly power changed direction once women stopped accepting humiliation quietly. "You're asking me to save your company." Graham exhaled slowly. "I'm asking you to discuss possibilities. Translation. Please don't destroy us completely." Ruth closed her eyes briefly, not out of anger, out of clarity, because suddenly she understood something important. Winning wasn't watching Graham suffer. Winning was becoming someone untouched by the need for his approval. "When's the meeting?" she asked calmly. After hanging up, Ruth walked slowly upstairs toward Lily's nursery. Moonlight spilled softly across the hallway. Inside the nursery, Lily slept curled beneath pink blankets while stuffed animals surrounded her protectively. Ruth sat beside the crib quietly, and for the first time in years she felt something stronger than revenge. Pride. Not because she became powerful, because she survived becoming powerless. Her phone lit up again beside her. Boardroom meeting confirmed, Monday, 9 a.m. Ruth stared at the message thoughtfully, then looked around the peaceful nursery she once cried inside nightly. Life had changed so completely. The same woman who sat on this floor believing she was broken beyond repair was now walking back into the boardroom as someone they feared losing. Slowly, Ruth smiled to herself, not bitterly, not triumphantly, just knowingly. Because some women don't rise after betrayal. They rebuild so beautifully that the people who broke them can no longer recognize the woman standing in front of them. Ruth wore white the morning she returned to the boardroom, not for innocence, for peace. The tailored ivory suit fit her differently than clothes used to months ago. Not because her body changed again, but because she no longer carried herself like someone apologizing for existing. Confidence altered posture more than weight ever could. As the elevator climbed toward the executive floor of Holloway, and Pierce Ruth looked at her reflection in the mirrored walls calmly. No wedding ring, no panic, no fear of being abandoned, just a woman who survived herself back into existence. Tyler stood beside her holding acquisition files while Daniel checked messages on his phone. "You nervous?" Tyler asked quietly. Ruth considered the question honestly. No. That surprised even her. Months ago, this building held every humiliation she couldn't survive gracefully. The firing, the affair, the recordings, the manipulation. Now it just looked like another office tower. Healing had stripped the ghosts from it. The elevator doors opened. Executives immediately straightened when Ruth stepped onto the floor. Interesting. Power announced itself silently long before anyone spoke. The assistant guiding them looked visibly intimidated. "This way, Ms. Burns." Again, Ms. Burns. Respect always arrived eventually once women stopped begging for it. As Ruth approached the boardroom, she noticed something strange. The hallway felt smaller. Or maybe she simply stopped shrinking herself to fit inside it. The doors opened slowly. Everyone stood when she entered. Everyone. Even Graham Holloway. For one brief second, Ruth remembered the last time she walked into this room, exhausted postpartum body leaking milk betrayal, sitting beside her humiliation, swallowing her whole. Now they looked nervous. The emotional reversal felt almost unreal. Cynthia Vale motioned toward the head chair. "Please." Ruth sat calmly. No trembling hands this time. No desperate need to be chosen. Across the table, Graham looked years older than before. Natalie wasn't there anymore. Interesting. Some people disappear once power stops protecting them. And near the far end of the table sat Zane quietly in a dark suit, looking like a man attending the funeral of his own life. Ruth met his eyes briefly. No hatred remained there. That chapter had burned itself out already. Cynthia cleared her throat carefully. "We appreciate Burns Creative agreeing to acquisition discussions." Ruth folded her hands calmly. "Let's skip the corporate politeness today." Silence. "Good. I'm not here because I suddenly care about saving Holloway and Pierce," she continued evenly. "I'm here because hundreds of employees don't deserve to lose careers because leadership failed ethically." The board shifted uncomfortably. "Truth tends to do that." Daniel slid documents across the table. Burns Creative's terms. Clear, ruthless, fair. Graham reviewed them slowly before looking up sharply. "You only want the strategic branding division." "Yes, that division built this company." Ruth held his gaze calmly. "I know, because she built that division. Her ideas, her campaigns, her emotional labor, years of invisible work finally acknowledged, too late." One board member frowned. "You could take much more." True. Burns Creative had enough leverage now to gut the company entirely if Ruth wanted revenge badly enough. But revenge no longer interested her. That surprised everyone except Ruth herself. She looked around the boardroom quietly. "You know what I realized during all this?" No one answered. "Pain makes people believe power means becoming crueler than the people who hurt them." Silence settled heavily. "But that's not power." Ruth's voice softened slightly. "That's damage." Even Graham looked away then, because somewhere deep down he knew exactly how much damage he caused. Ruth continued carefully. "I'm not interested in humiliating anyone." Zane closed his eyes briefly at those words, maybe because humiliation was exactly what he feared most now. "I'm interested in building things differently." That sentence changed the room emotionally. Not vengeance, vision. That frightened powerful people far more. Cynthia looked down at the proposal again. "These terms protect maternity leave policies company-wide." "Yes." "Mandatory leadership reviews regarding discrimination." "Yes." "Flexible executive scheduling for parents." "Yes." Ruth's voice remained steady now. "Because no woman should have to choose between survival and motherhood." Complete silence. Months ago, they called her emotional for saying things like that. Now they called it policy reform. Funny how respect follows financial leverage. Graham finally spoke again. "You really think you can change corporate culture?" Ruth looked directly at him. "No," she answered honestly. "I think women already are." The truth of that settled quietly across the room. Because every executive there knew the landscape was shifting already. Women were leaving toxic systems, building alternatives, refusing silence. And companies that failed to adapt were collapsing under their own arrogance. After another hour of negotiations, signatures finally began, one by one. Carefully, historically. Ruth signed last. Burns Creative officially acquired the division she built years earlier, not through begging, not through loyalty, through surviving betrayal without losing herself completely. As the meeting ended, executives slowly filtered out of the boardroom. Soon only Ruth and Zane remained inside. The silence between them felt strangely peaceful now. No tension, no performance. Just two people standing in the ruins of something that once mattered deeply. Zane approached slowly. "You won." Ruth looked out the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. "No." He frowned slightly. "It feels like you did." She shook her head gently. "Winning would have been keeping my marriage, my career, and my identity all at once." That truth hurt because it was honest. Some losses remain losses, even after healing. Zane swallowed hard. "I still can't believe how strong you became." Ruth almost smiled sadly. "I was always strong." The sentence hit him visibly, because it was true. People simply mistake kindness for weakness until kindness disappears. Zane looked down briefly. "I wish I understood that sooner." Ruth believed him, but healing taught her something painful. Understanding late still leaves damage behind. She gathered her coat calmly, then Zane asked the question she knew was coming eventually. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me completely?" Ruth paused near the boardroom doors, thought about it honestly, then answered, "I think forgiveness is waking up one day and realizing your name no longer hurts when I hear it." His eyes filled quietly. "And does it?" Ruth considered carefully, then smiled faintly. "Not anymore." That nearly destroyed him, because the opposite of love was never hate. It was emotional freedom. Ruth walked out of the boardroom slowly, past the same hallway where she once saw Natalie wearing her necklace, past the same elevators where she cried silently after being fired. Everything looked smaller now, not because the building changed, because she had. Outside, warm spring sunlight flooded Manhattan streets, while city noise echoed around her. Tyler and Daniel waited near the curb beside a black car, and in the back seat Lily. The moment Lily saw Ruth, she squealed happily and reached both tiny arms upward. "Mommy." Ruth laughed softly and lifted her daughter into her arms immediately. That word still healed parts of her every time. Not because motherhood saved her, because motherhood forced her to stop abandoning herself. Daniel opened the car door. "You ready?" Ruth looked back once toward the towering Holloway and Pierce building behind her. Months ago, she thought losing that place meant losing everything. Now she understood something different. Sometimes life removes people and places because they were built around your suffering, not your growth. Ruth kissed Lily's forehead gently before sliding into the car. No wedding ring, no bitterness, no need for revenge anymore, just peace. And as Manhattan disappeared behind them beneath golden sunlight, Ruth realized the cruelest thing a woman can do to the people who broke her is heal beautifully without them. Ruth Burns' journey is not just a story about betrayal, revenge, or rebuilding a career. It is a reminder of something far more uncomfortable and far more powerful. Sometimes the people closest to us don't destroy our lives. All at once, they slowly train us to forget our own worth. Ruth didn't wake up one day and become strong. She became strong because she had no other choice left after being overlooked, dismissed, and emotionally drained by the very people she trusted most. What makes her transformation so deeply human is not the success at the end, but the breaking points in between. The quiet nights holding her newborn while questioning her own value. The moments she apologized for needing rest. The times she believed love meant endurance. So many people live in that space where love feels like sacrifice and silence feels like survival. But Ruth's story also shows something else. Awakening is not always loud. It doesn't always look like revenge or confrontation. Sometimes awakening is simply the moment you stop asking, "Why am I not enough?" and start asking, "Why did I accept being treated this way?" That shift changes everything. It doesn't make the pain disappear, but it stops the pain from defining you. True strength is not becoming colder. It is becoming clearer. Ruth didn't become powerful because she hurt others back. She became powerful because she chose herself without needing permission. She rebuilt, not to prove a point, but to reclaim her identity beyond what others reduced her to. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: walking away from disrespect is not losing love. It is finally finding self-respect. Healing does not always feel like victory in the beginning. Sometimes it feels like grief, but on the other side of that grief is a life where you are no longer surviving emotional neglect. You are building something that reflects your worth. If Ruth's journey resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever stayed too long in a place where you were no longer valued, or chosen silence over your own peace, just to keep something alive that was already breaking you? Share your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely love to hear your story and perspective. And if you enjoy emotional storytelling like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories about resilience, betrayal, healing, and self-worth coming soon.